This is King World News. I'm Eric King, and you're about to hear a tremendous interview with Congressman Ron Paul, author of the Audit the Fed bill and a champion of freedom in this country. Remember to go to our homepage at www.kingworldnews.com for more interviews, where this week we also have popular financial blogger Mike Shedlock, known as Mish, as well as Rick Rule, one of the most street-smart pros in the resource sector. Joining us now is Congressman Ron Paul, a champion of freedom and the Constitution and the originator of the Audit the Fed bill. Congressman Paul, I believe, like you, that the Fed is immoral and needs to be abolished, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But first, talk to listeners about the importance of the need to audit the Federal Reserve, to know exactly what they are up to, please.
So I think this is the first step. The American people need to know exactly what the Fed does, and we've been denied this information from the very beginning. The Federal Reserve started in 1913, and it's really never been audited. One time they tried to change the law in 1978, but it did more harm than good because it excluded all of the important issues that should not be audited. So once again, we're in a crisis, and the bill becomes more appropriate, and we have 307 co-sponsors on it. And I believe this is the first step to find out who gets the benefits, who gets the loans, why, and what kind of agreements they have around the world, and then go from there. Of course, I would end the Fed, but others would do other things. It seems like a large coalition of both liberals and conservatives agree that the Federal Reserve should be exposed. We should know what they're doing.
The Federal Reserve, regarding the H.R. 1207 bill, stated that it would make interest rates skyrocket and the dollar would devalue significantly if the audit took place. Did that not strike you as a strange way to react to an audit?
Yeah, just trying to build up fear, and what they're implying is all of a sudden we're going to have control of monetary policy, which it explicitly does not do that. That is not the intent, because I realized how controversial that would be, and besides, although Barney Frank is working with me to some degree, he and I wouldn't agree on monetary policy, but we do agree on transparency and that we should know about it. So the Fed chairman comes back and says, oh, if you guys are looking over our shoulders, then we're going to be pressured not to be lenient with the monetary spigots, and you'll put pressure on us. But if anything, political pressure, they went lower interest rates. And there is political pressure on the Fed already. I mean, they accommodate the president, and they accommodate elections, and, of course, they accommodate the banks. That's political pressure, or Goldman Sachs. That's political pressure. But for him to say that all of a sudden if this bill were to be passed, it's going to raise interest rates, I think he's just striking out on there and trying to scare the people.
A centralized money printing central bank benefits the elite few at the expense of everyone else. When do you think the Fed will be abolished, and what time frame? I know I'm asking you to speculate here, Congressman Paul, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not optimistic that it's going to be coming soon through legislation. We could pass the bill next week and repeal the Federal Reserve Act, which was written in 1913. But that's not likely to happen. It scares a lot of people, and I even argue that if you're going to get rid of the Fed under these conditions, you should phase it out. But it's more likely to end because it quits working. And when they totally destroy the dollar, if we have a runaway inflation and the dollar goes to near zero or something, the Fed will just be out of business because nobody will trust them anymore, and something will have to be done and have to be revised. And I have no guess when that's going to happen. If we continue to do what we're doing, spending and printing money, eventually people will lose trust in the dollar. Not tomorrow, next week, but it could be next year or 2 or 3 or 4 for all we know, because we're not hesitant one bit in Washington to back off any spending and any borrowing, which puts the pressure on the Fed, to monetize the debt and to print this money. But even if we get our audit bill passed, there's going to be a lot of resistance to it. If we pass it in the House, it still has to go through the Senate. The President still has to sign it. Then it's going to go to the court. Just like right now, the courts ruled in favor of Bloomberg looking at some of these records under the Freedom of Information Act, but the Federal Reserve is really, really fighting that hard. And unfortunately, the courts over our history have always ruled in favor of the government and central banking, and always against sound money.
You made this statement in a recent interview. Fraud is a significant problem, but the government is committing the fraud, end quote. And that was in relation to a different topic that I'm about to bring up, but here's one of the problems I have right now, Congressman Paul. Banks' balance sheets are phony. The books are cooked, and the government is encouraging this activity. It's encouraging it and aiding and abetting this fraud. And it would otherwise be criminal fraud with regards to the bank's accounting in an attempt to hide from the rest of the world the fact that our banking system is insolvent. Why is our government encouraging this criminal fraud in the name of national security, probably, within the banking system to manufacture a stock market rally? And why has our government become so corrupt, do you think?
Well, I guess it's the yield to the temptation. Some of them believe it through their economic education that this is right and proper, and Keynesian economics actually teach this, that you should have a government that prints money, which is counterfeit, and you should have fractional reserve banking because it stimulates the economy. And Congress literally creates programs like Medicare and Social Security, and they're not really funded, and yet they pretend that they're funding. If a private person did that, they could go to prison. But if you printed money, you'd be a counterfeiter, you'd go to prison. But the government gets away with this. So once the government embarks on this, their friends participate. And when they get into trouble, I mean, what happens? The government comes to their rescue and bails out their friends, and the people who are not on the inside, they tend to lose. They may go bankrupt, but somebody like Goldman Sachs benefits, and some of the people who thought they were getting a great deal, not putting any money down, they lose their houses. So it's a corrupt system based on the notion that governments can do things that they're not really able to do. At the same time, I put so much back to the corruption of money and the inconsistency in their definitions and not following what we were told to do, and that is make only gold and silver legal tender.
You brought up the bailouts there for a minute. And what about the bailouts that took place in this country? I know you voted against them, but how immoral is it that those took place? And that in some cases, former Treasury Secretary Paulson was acting as a wrecking machine, saving some firms to the benefit of Goldman Sachs, such as AIG, but then allowing others to go under, such as Lehman Brothers, which Goldman Sachs was the primary beneficiary of Lehman's failure. And he had to get an ethics waiver from the White House in order to do that. What are your thoughts on that, Congressman Paul?
Well, I think there's two parts of it. First, when government takes the money, I think it's an immoral act, either through taxation or deceitfully through the printing of money, so just that act is bad. But then when they start passing out the favors and passing out either contracts or bailouts, it even becomes more corrupt. And, of course, when the people realize what's going on, they get rather angry about this, and I think that's what's happening. But they're directing their attention in the right direction, that is up toward Washington. And fortunately, they're looking at what the Fed does and what the Treasury has done. But it's sort of contagious that once we start on this, people figure, oh, well, this is the way the system works. We better do our very best to get what we can while the getting's good.
What about the mountains of debt that the United States has accumulated? Before the Depression started, I think the debt to GDP was roughly 260%. And I think this time Soros is saying on this cycle it'll be 550%. But Rob Arnott, who is unquestionably one of the great minds in the financial world today and also a libertarian, calculated our nation's debt to GDP, including corporate, household, Social Security, and Medicare, et cetera, and came up with a staggering debt to GDP of 850%.
Wow.
And that doesn't include the off-balance sheet stuff or second quarter binge, and stated also that he has never met anyone who owed over 8 times their annual income where the outcome was graceful or smooth.
Yeah. If anybody wanted to look at one key factor about where our problems come from, I would say it's debt. That represents the growth of government. It's too bad they didn't put it in the Constitution. It was unconstitutional to borrow money, but they debated it and talked about it, but then they allowed the government to borrow money. And this, to me, is, the real problem because this debt won't be paid for. So the debt eventually gets liquidated. People keep saying that, oh, well, who's going to have to pay this debt? Well, it gets liquidated. Our grandchildren won't end up paying for this. If it lasts for a while, like it has already, another generation may suffer. But the debt gets liquidated, and when it's discovered that they can't pay it, they can always send you money. If you own Treasury bills, they can always send you money, or they can always send you a check on Social Security. But what they can't do is maintain the value. So if you have a 10% inflation rate of prices, the debt is going down 10%. So if there's $10 trillion debt, national